Hey guys, tonight I want to start with a number, and then I want to tell you why that number has been lying to you for about 140 years. 25 cents. In the summer of 1881, in a dry goods store in Dakota Territory, a 14-year-old girl sat down at a sewing table and sewed shirt buttonholes all day, 6 days a week, for 25 cents a day and her dinner. $1.50 a week, $9 for a summer. The books made that wage sound charming. Laura, earning her keep. Laura is being spunky. Laura multiplying her wages in her head and feeling pleased. Here is what the books did not put next to that number. The 25 cents was buying her older sister's future back. Not her sight. Nobody on earth could give Mary Ingalls her eyes again. But the wage was paying to put Mary on a train across 2 territories to a college for the blind in Iowa, where she would learn to read with her fingers, to play the organ, to walk through a room without sitting frozen in a chair waiting for someone to move her. The books turned a child's wage labour into a sweet summer job. The record turns it back into what it was, a 14-year-old paying the bill for her sister's education, with her own childhood as the currency. And there is one more thing the books did not tell you, because Laura herself may not have known it when she wrote them. The system Mary learned at the blind school was not Braille. It was a different raised dot code called New York Point, and by the time Laura published the books in the 1930s and 40s, New York Point was already losing a war it would eventually lose completely. Braille won. New York Point died. The system that Mary Ingalls spent 7 years learning to read with her fingers is now extinct. Almost nobody alive can read what she read. The language she learned in the dark went dark a second time. Hold that. A blind girl whose education was paid for by her sister's needle, and the very skill that education bought is now a dead language, unreadable, gone. The bill was paid in buttonholes. The receipt is written in a code nobody can open. Tonight is the story of how that bill got built, who actually paid it, what it bought, and why the published version had to make the paying look easy, in order for the family to survive being remembered at all. It runs from a fever in February of 1879 to a letter in 1892 that closed a door on Mary forever, and the distance between those 2 dates is where a teenage girl was quietly turned into the economic engine of an entire household. Here is the road we are walking. A 14-year-old girl whose sight went out like a lamp running out of oil. A winter that nearly starved the whole family and forced the dreamer father to take a wage job he had spent his life running from. A territorial law that agreed to pay for one piece of Mary's education and left the rest to be scraped together by a household with no margin. A summer of buttonholes. A teaching job at 16, in a claimed shanty 12 miles from home, boarding with a woman who one night picked up a butcher knife. A blind school in Iowa where Mary learned a language that is now dead, refused a marriage proposal because she could not bear the thought of a child whose face she would never see, and she graduated into a life of making fly nets for horses. A daughter named Rose who edited the books to fit a political philosophy she was building in the 1930s. And a letter, 3 years after Mary graduated, that told her the door was closed and going back would be impossible. It begins, the way too many things in this family begin, with water, and it ends with a blind woman in a chair in Smet, playing an organ for nobody, in a house her younger sister's wages had helped hold together, reading a dead language by touch for 49 years. And one more thing before we walk in. The history of blindness in America in the 1880s is not a history of compassion. It is a history of institutions. A blind person in the 1880s had, roughly, 3 futures. The first was the poorhouse, the county facility where the indigent, the disabled, the elderly and the insane were warehoused together in conditions that were, by every surviving account, worse than prison. The second was the family, the blind person staying home, sitting in a chair, becoming a charge on the household for the rest of their life, with no education, no trade, no capacity to produce. The third was the school, the institution, like the one in Vinton, that took blind students and taught them to read, to play music, to make things, to be, in the language of the time, useful. The Ingalls family chose the third. That choice was not inevitable. Most families in their position chose the second. Some, unable to bear the second, ended at the first. The Ingalls family chose the school because Caroline especially would not accept the chair. Caroline had watched her own mother hold a fatherless household together through hungry winters. Caroline had buried a son. Caroline was not going to watch her blind daughter sit in a chair for 50 years if there was any alternative on earth, and the alternative on earth was a college for the blind in Vinton, Iowa, 400 miles southeast, paid for by a territorial appropriation that covered the floor and not the roof. The school was the choice. The bill was the cost of the choice. The needle was how the bill got paid, and the dead language was what the school taught, before the dead language died. That is the whole story, compressed into one paragraph. The rest of tonight is the slow, careful, documented expansion. Mary Amelia Ingalls was born on the 10th of January 1865 in Pepin County, Wisconsin, the big woods country, the cabin in the trees that Laura would later make famous. She was the first living child of Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, and on the frontier, the first child is proof that the household works. The first child is the one the parents watch to see whether they are going to make it. Mary passed every test the family needed her to pass. She was quiet. She was neat. She learned her letters early. She had the kind of stillness that pioneer mothers prayed for in a daughter, the kind that means a child will sit through a long sermon, hold a younger sister on her lap during a wagon crossing, keep her hands busy while her mouth stays shut. Caroline, who had grown up fatherless after a schooner went down on Lake Michigan in 1845, had spent her own girlhood learning that order and caution were the only thing standing between a family and the cold. She recognized something in Mary, the same careful streak, the same instinct to fold a thing neatly instead of throwing it down. Laura came 2 years later, in February of 1867, and from the start the two sisters were a matched set in the family's imagination, the steady older one and the wild younger one. Mary sat still. Laura did not. Mary minded. Laura asked why. The pattern was set so early that neither girl would have remembered a time before it existed. Between Mary's birth in 1865 and her 14th birthday in 1879, the family packed up and moved at least 6 times. Wisconsin to Kansas, to Wisconsin to Minnesota, to Iowa to Minnesota again, and finally toward Dakota Territory. Each move reset the household. Each move cost money they did not have. And through every one of those moves, Mary was the child who held her shape, the one Caroline could put in charge of Carrie and Grace for an afternoon, the one who would sit through a grasshopper plague in Minnesota in the 1870s without complaining about the wheat the sky ate, the one the family quietly assumed would, when the time came, do something respectable. Teach school, perhaps, or marry well, or both. The pattern of the moves is worth pausing on, because the pattern is what the books smooth into adventure, and the record reveals as something closer to flight. Charles Ingalls did not move west the way the books suggest, steadily, purposefully, toward a dream. Charles moved the way a man moves when he cannot hold a piece of ground. The Kansas move in 1869, the one the second book is built around, ended when Charles was told correctly that the land he had settled on still belonged to the Osage under treaty, and that he was squatting. The family left Kansas in the middle of the night, ahead of the soldiers who were coming to remove the white settlers. The books turn this into a quiet departure. The record turns it into what it was, a flight, ahead of the army, off land that was not theirs. The moves to Minnesota, the ones around Plum Creek, the ones the books make beautiful, ended in the grasshopper plagues of the 1870s. Rocky Mountain locusts came down on the wheat country in bodies so thick they dimmed the sun. They ate everything, crops to the dirt, leather harness, fence posts, the wool off live sheep, the clothes off a line. Then they laid eggs in the ruined fields and died, and the next summer the eggs hatched and it happened again. Charles could not pay his debts. The family left Minnesota for Iowa, where they ran a hotel in Burr Oak, a period the books skip entirely, because the hotel years were hard years, and the books were not going to include the unromantic part of the frontier. The family came back to Minnesota, then went to Dakota Territory, because Charles had heard the railroad was hiring. That is the man who was sitting in the room when Mary went blind. Not the dreamer of the books, a man who had been running his whole adult life from the consequences of his own restlessness. A man who had squatted on Osage land and been removed. A man who had been broken by grasshoppers. A man who had run a hotel in Burr Oak and left it. A man who had moved his wife and 4 daughters across 6 states in 14 years because he could not hold a piece of ground, and who was now, in February of 1879, sitting in a house in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, watching his oldest daughter lose her sight, and knowing, the way a man who's been running knows, that the running was about to have to stop. The running stopped because of Mary. That is the fact the books cannot say out loud, because saying it would make Mary's blindness the reason the family settled, and the books need the family to settle because of Pa's dream, not because of Pa's daughter's catastrophe. But the record is clear. Charles Ingalls took a wage job, the thing he had spent his entire adult life refusing, because his blind daughter needed a school he could not afford and a household he could not keep uprooting. The dreamer became a storekeeper. The covered wagon became a mortgage. The man who had been running since 1869 stopped running in 1879, in a town that did not yet exist, on a prairie that would try to kill his family the following winter. Mary anchored him. That is the truth the books soften. The blind daughter was the anchor. The wandering stopped because the blind daughter could not be moved again, and the wandering stopping is what made the books possible, because the books are about a family that settles, that finds a town, that puts down roots, and the family only did those things because the blind daughter forced them to. That is the daughter who existed before February of 1879, not a saint, not a symbol, a real teenage girl with a real place in a real household's plan. The plan that said, we are poor and we move too much and the sky keeps eating our crops, but we have a steady firstborn, and the steady firstborn will be all right, and so will we. Then a fever came. Put yourself in the room. February of 1879, Walnut Grove, Minnesota. The family is still there, the town the television show would later make famous, the town where Charles had taken a job running a hotel and selling goods, trying to hold the family in one place after the grasshoppers had wrecked the wheat for years. The thermometer has dropped below 0 and stayed there. The walls are board walls, the windows are single panes, the stove is going day and night and it cannot keep up with what comes in through the cracks. Mary is 14, Laura is 11, Carrie is 9, Grace is a toddler. Mary takes sick first. A high fever, headache. The kind of illness that begins looking like the flu and then, somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd day, stops looking like the flu and starts looking like something else. The books would later call it scarlet fever. The medical record, reconstructed in 2013 by a paediatrician named Dr. Beth Tarini and published in the journal Pediatrics, says it almost certainly was not. Scarlet fever has a particular signature, a rough red rash, a strawberry tongue, a specific progression. The surviving descriptions of Mary's illness, including Laura's own later letters and recollections, do not match that signature. What they do match, with uncomfortable precision, is the signature of an infection that inflames the brain and the membranes around it. Viral meningoencephalitis. The doctors at the time had a plainer name for it, brain fever. And brain fever was not something a family survived cleanly. Brain fever was the phrase that appeared in obituaries, the symptoms a doctor in 1879 would have watched for. A fever that spiked and held, severe headache, sensitivity to light, stiffness in the neck, confusion in a child old enough to articulate it. And then, in the worst cases, a creeping numbness, a loss of function, a darkening at the edges of vision that did not stop. Mary's sight went. Not in a single dramatic moment. That is not how these things happen. It went over weeks. First the edges, then the colour, then the shapes, then the light itself, until there was nothing left but the memory of having seen. Imagine you are Mary. You're 14. You've been the steady one your whole life, the one who sits still, the one the family counts on. And now, day by day, the world is being taken from you in a direction nobody can stop. And the doctors in a Minnesota railroad town in 1879 have no idea why. And no tool to reverse it, and no language to explain it that does not involve the word fever and a shrug. You can hear your mother moving in the next room. You can hear your sister Laura asking questions you cannot answer. You can hear your father counting something. Money probably, because there is never enough, and now there is going to be less, because something is going to have to be done about you, and whatever that something is, it will cost. The family called it scarlet fever in the version that survived. They may have called it that at the time too. The phrase was loose in the 19th century, applied to almost any childhood illness with a rash and high temperature. But the doctors, when they were being precise, used the other phrase, brain fever. And brain fever was the phrase that appeared in obituaries. Mary did not die. She came out of the fever with her life and without her sight, and the family was left holding both of those things at once. The relief that she was still breathing, and the recognition that the daughter they had built a future around now needed a future built for her instead. Carolyn, who had spent her whole life folding grief where it could not embarrass anyone, folded this one too. The surviving record gives us almost nothing of what she said about Mary's blindness in the months after it happened. That silence is itself a document. Laura Ingalls did not write her grief down because writing it down would have made it a thing the family had to look at, and the family could not afford to look at it. They had to keep moving. They had to keep eating. They had a blind teenager, a toddler, and 2 younger girls, and the wheat had been eaten by grasshoppers for years, and Charles was already itching to move again. Where do you go when your steady daughter has just gone blind and your husband wants to move west and the money is gone? You go where the railroad is going. Because the railroad in 1879 was the one institution on the frontier that paid a man a wage he could count on, in cash, every month, for doing work that did not depend on the weather or the wheat or the grasshoppers. And Charles Ingalls, the man who had spent his entire adult life running from wage labour, who had chased land across 4 states, because owning land meant being nobody's employee, was about to do the thing he had sworn he would never do. He was about to take a job, and the blind daughter is the reason the wandering stopped. There is a particular kind of grief that frontier women were expected to carry without mentioning, and Laura Ingalls carried more of it than the books ever let on. She had already buried a son. Charles Frederick Ingalls, Freddie, born in 1875 in Walnut Grove, died before his first birthday. The books do not include him. Laura could not bring herself to write him in. The family that crossed the plains in the published series has 4 daughters. The family that actually crossed the plains had 4 daughters, and a grave they never spoke about. Caroline had also, before Freddie, watched her own father drown. Henry Quiner went down with a trading schooner on Lake Michigan in November of 1845 when Caroline was 5 years old. She grew up fatherless on the edge of settled country, in an age with no insurance, no pension, no safety net. The frontier had exactly one welfare program, and it was called relatives. Caroline learned by the time she was 6 that the world could remove a man from a household without warning, and that the household had to keep running anyway. That is the woman who was sitting in the room when Mary went blind. Not a saint. A survivor. A woman who had already absorbed the loss of a father and the loss of a son, and who had learned, as a survival skill, to fold the grief into the work so completely that the grief became the work. Caroline did not cry where Mary could hear her, because crying would have told Mary that the situation was worse than Mary already knew it was, and Mary already knew it was bad. Caroline did not write her grief down. She got up. She started the next meal. She counted the flour. She did the thing that frontier women did, which was to keep the household running through catastrophes that would have broken a person who had the luxury to break. And here is the cruelty underneath the courage. The same folding that let Caroline survive was the folding that would, 60 years later, let Laura write the books without mentioning any of it. The silence Caroline practiced as survival became, in the published version, the silence of the narrative itself. The books are cheerful because Caroline was cheerful. Caroline was cheerful because she had learned at 5 years old that the alternative was to lie down, and lying down was not an option on the frontier. So when Mary went blind, Caroline did what Caroline always did. She folded, she kept moving, and she began, quietly, to do the arithmetic that the family would need to do for the next decade. The arithmetic of how a household with no margin was going to cover the cost of a blind daughter's education. The arithmetic is the next chapter. But first, the family had to get to Dakota Territory, and the winter that was waiting for them, there was going to be unlike anything any of them had ever seen. The Ingalls family reached Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1879. Charles had heard that the Chicago and Northwestern Railway was pushing its line west toward the new town of Smet. The railroad needed a storekeeper, a bookkeeper, a timekeeper, someone to track the hours of the men laying rail across the open prairie. Charles took all 3 jobs. The man who could not sit still on a piece of land sat still on a piece of land because his blind daughter needed a school he could not afford and a household he could not keep uprooting. The first winter, the winter of 1879 and 80, was hard. The family lived in the surveyor's house, a structure the railroad had built for its own men, which Charles talked his way into borrowing for the season. Mary, blind for almost a year by then, sat through it. They survived. The winter that followed it was worse, and by worse, I mean one of the worst winters in the recorded meteorological history of the American Great Plains. The first blizzard hit between October 15th and October 18th, 1880. October. Blizzards in October are nearly unheard of east of the Rocky Mountains. The Canton Advocate, a South Dakota newspaper, ran an article on October 21st that read, in part, "A terrible snowstorm, probably the worst that Southern Dakota ever witnessed, passed over this region of country, commencing on last Friday with thunder and lightning, and continuing until Saturday at midnight. It caused a general suspension of business, blowing down telegraph wires, blockading railroads, the snow drifting to the depth of from 15 to 25 feet in cuts along the line of the roads. Thunder and lightning, in a blizzard, in October, and then the snow drifted to 25 feet in the railroad cuts. That was the beginning." The winter did not end until April of 1881. 6 months. Blizzard after blizzard. The train stopped running. The wheat could not be ground because the mills could not get fuel. The household twisted hay into twists to burn in the stove because the coal had run out and there was no wood on the prairie to cut. Snowdrifts in Minnesota were photographed higher than locomotives. Laura would later make this winter famous like the Long Winter. The newspaper name for it at the time was the Hard Winter, or the Black Winter, or the Starvation Winter. Now put yourself in the room. You are Laura. You're 13. Your blind sister is in the next chair. Your mother is twisting hay by the stove, her hands raw, the lamp smoking because the oil is low. Your father is counting cups of flour. Outside, the wind sounds like a freight train that never arrives. The snow has buried the door up to the windowsill. The train that was supposed to bring supplies has not come in weeks because the tracks are buried under drifts taller than the train itself, and the railroad has given up trying to clear them until spring. There is no food coming. The flour barrel is going down. You can hear your mother counting in her head. How many cups are left? How many days? How many mouths? Your blind sister cannot see the flour barrel going down. She cannot see the colour leaving your mother's face, but she can hear everything. The wind. The silence when the wind stops. The counting. The counting. The counting. A blind person in a starving household hears the household's fear more clearly than the sighted people in the room because the sighted people have the luxury of looking away and the blind person only has listening left. And here is the part the books had to leave out because it is too ugly for a children's story. There is a real question, by February of 1881, whether the family is going to make it. Not metaphorically, literally. The railroad has stopped. The wheat is gone. The town of Smet is starving. People are eating seed wheat, the wheat that was supposed to be planted in the spring, because there is nothing else. In the books, a young farmer named Almanzo Wilder and his friend Cap Garland ride out across the prairie, find a homesteader with wheat to sell, and bring it back to save the town. It is one of the most famous scenes in the series. Here is what the record shows. The Pioneer Girl Project. the scholars who spent years annotating Laura's unpublished memoir, could find no historical record of this ride outside of Laura's own books. No newspaper account, no Garland family story, even though Cap Garland lived another 10 years in the same county and died there in 1891. If a young farmer had ridden across the frozen prairie in February of 1881 to save a starving town, somebody would have written it down. Nobody did. The ride may have happened. The record cannot confirm it. The wheat may have arrived. The record cannot confirm that either. Here is what the record does confirm. The town of Smet, by February of 1881, was eating seed wheat. The trains had not run in weeks. The railroad had given up clearing the tracks until spring, because every time they cleared a cut, the wind filled it back in overnight. The mills could not grind because they could not get fuel. The grocery stores were empty. The families who had stores were dividing them among neighbours, and the stores were going down. The Ingalls family in their store building on the main street was twisting hay into tight bundles to burn in the stove. Hay twists. That is what they burned. Not wood. There was no wood on the prairie. Not coal. The coal had run out in January. Hay, twisted into tight rope-like bundles that burned hot and fast and left a smell that Laura would remember 60 years later as the smell of that winter. The family twisted hay all day. They burned it all night. The stove could not keep the room warm on hay twists alone. The walls were board walls, the wind came through the cracks, and the temperature inside the room by morning would have a thin skin of ice on the water bucket. Picture the labour of a hay twist winter. You wake in the dark, the stove is out. Someone, Caroline probably, is already twisting hay to restart it. The floor is cold through your shoes. Your blind sister is in the next bed, awake, listening, because blind people wake when the household wakes, and the household wakes when the stove goes out, and the stove goes out every 3 hours because hay twists do not last. You twist hay. You feed the stove. You eat whatever is left. Coarse bread, maybe, made from the last of the flour, the loaf getting smaller every day. You count the cups. You do not talk about the counting because talking about it would make it real. And the unspoken rule of a starving household is that the starvation stays unspoken until someone breaks. Nobody breaks. That is the rule. That is how they survived. And into this household every day came the sound of a blind girl who could not see the flour barrel going down, but who could hear the counting and who knew, because she was 14 and not stupid, exactly what the counting meant. Mary knew they were hungry. Mary knew the bread was getting smaller. Mary knew the trains had not come. She could not see any of it. She could hear all of it. And she sat in her chair, and she did not complain, because complaining was not something this family did. That is the winter the books made famous. The books are accurate about the cold, the hunger, the hay twists, the terror. The books are not accurate about one thing, and it is the thing that matters most for tonight. The books present the winter as something the family survived through their own grit and the heroic ride of a young farmer. The record presents the winter as something the family survived because the federal government, in the form of the territorial appropriation that would pay for Mary's schooling 2 years later, was already the backstop that made frontier life possible. The railroad Charles worked for was a federally chartered corporation. The land the family homesteaded was federal land, opened by federal treaty. The school Mary would attend was paid for by a territorial appropriation, a government program. The family that the books would later present as the embodiment of self-reliance was, in fact, living inside a web of federal support at every level, and the web was the reason they survived. The books could not say that. The books were written in the 1930s and 40s, in a country that wanted its pioneer stories to be about self-reliance. A book that said, the Ingalls family survived the long winter because of federal railroad charters, federal land policy, and a territorial appropriation that would later pay for the blind daughter's education. That book would not have been the book the country wanted to read. But it is the book the record allows. And the record is what tonight is for. Winter broke. The trains ran again. The family survived. And Charles Ingalls, who had taken the railroad job because his blind daughter needed a stationary household, held that job for the next decade. The dreamer who had bounced off 4 states stopped dreaming. The blind girl anchored the family to the ground the way an anchor anchors a ship, suddenly, permanently, in a place none of them had planned to stay. The winter took something from the family that the books do not name. It took the last illusion that the frontier was romantic. After the winter of 1880 and 81, the Ingalls family knew exactly what the prairie could do to them, and they never forgot it. Caroline knew, Charles knew, and Laura, who would one day write the books, Laura knew too, and the books she wrote would carry the winter inside them like a scar, even when they softened everything else. But the books could not soften what came next. Because after the winter, the question of Mary's future stopped being something the family could put off. She was 15. She had been blind for 2 years. She had spent those 2 years sitting in the surveyor's house, sitting in the new house Charles was building on a homestead claim outside town, sitting in a chair while her younger sisters went to school and her mother kept the household, and her father went to work for the railroad. The family had survived the winter. Now they had to figure out what to do with the blind daughter who could not sit in a chair for the next 50 years. There was a school. There was specifically a college for the blind. It was not in Dakota Territory. Dakota Territory had nothing of the kind. It was in Vinton, Iowa, 400 miles southeast, the Iowa College for the Blind. It took out-of-state students. It taught them to read with their fingers, to sew, to knit, to play the organ, to navigate a room. The school would give Mary back the capacity to move, to make, to communicate. The family had to find a way to put her on the train. And the question of who was going to find that money is the question that quietly reorganized the entire Ingalls household for the next decade. Here is the document at the center of tonight's story, and it is not in any of the 8 books. Dakota Territory in the 1880s had no school for the blind of its own. The territory was too new, too sparse, too broken, but the territorial legislature had done something pragmatic. It had passed a law providing that blind residents of Dakota Territory could be sent to an out-of-state school, the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton most commonly, and that the territory would pay for it. Read the fine print, because the fine print is where this story lives. The territory would pay for tuition. The territory would pay for board. The territory would pay for these things for a maximum of 5 years per student. That was the original law, as Mary's family encountered it in the early 1880s. What the territory would not pay for was everything else: clothing, books, incidentals. The cost of putting a blind girl on a train into Smet and getting her 400 miles to Vinton, Iowa, and then getting her back for holidays, and then getting her back to Vinton again year after year. The railroad fare, the trunk, the dresses she would need, because a girl at a college for the blind could not show up in the dress she'd worn through a starvation winter. The shoes, the slates and the writing paper, the small dignity expenses that the law did not think of, because the law was written by men who had never tried to send a blind daughter anywhere. The appropriation was real. It mattered. Without it, Mary's education would have been simply impossible. The appropriation was the floor. But the floor did not include a roof, and the Ingalls family was left standing in the rain on top of it, trying to cover everything above the floor with whatever they could scrape together. There is a particular kind of poverty that the frontier specialized in, and it is worth naming because it is not the poverty people picture when they hear the word. The Ingalls family was not destitute. Charles had a wage now. The railroad paid him, regularly, in cash. The family was poor in the way a family is poor when there is a small income, and a large unexpected expense and no margin at all. The kind of poor where one bad winter, one more grasshopper year, one broken window, one more illness, tips the whole structure over. Mary's blind school was that large unexpected expense spread across a decade. So the household did what frontier households did when the territory covered one half of a bill and left the other half uncovered. It turned to its own labour. Every person in the Ingalls family who could work, worked. Charles worked the railroad job and took carpentry on the side. Caroline sewed and gardened and stretched the flour barrel, and took in boarders when she had to. Carrie, when she was old enough, worked too, Frail as she was, the record shows her taking odd jobs in town as a teenager. And Laura. Laura was 14 in the spring of 1881, when the family was getting ready to put Mary on the train to Vinton for the first time. She was the second daughter. She was not the steady one. That had been Mary's role. She was the wild one, the one who had to be watched, the one the family had always figured would absorb her own wildness as the cost of having her around. And now, suddenly, she was the one the family needed to produce income, because the territorial appropriation covered tuition and board and nothing else, and the nothing else was going to run for 5 years minimum, and the only person in the household with a free pair of hands that summer was a 14-year-old girl who had just watched her older sister go blind. The summer of 1881. Smet was a town now, or trying to be one. The railroad had come through. The main street had a few real buildings, be a store, a hotel, a land office, the dry goods shop called Clancy's. The Ingalls family had moved back into town for the season, into the building Charles had put up the year before. Laura needed work, the family needed income, and in a town the size of Smet in 1881, the work available to a 14-year-old girl was not large. She could not lay rail. She could not clerk, not without experience, and not in a town where the few clerk jobs went to men. She could teach, but not yet. She was 2 years away from being old enough even to test for a certificate, and the territorial age requirement technically was 18. What Laura could do was sew. She could sew because Caroline had taught her, the way Caroline taught all her daughters, because sewing was the one skill a frontier girl could carry into any household and any marriage and any wage-earning situation that might arise. Laura could run a seam. She could set a sleeve. She could, crucially, work a buttonhole, the fiddly, slow, precise work that turned a piece of cloth into a shirt that a man would pay money for. A woman in town, a Mrs. White, was taking a contract to make shirts. She needed help. She had more shirt orders than she could sew alone, and the buttonholes were piling up, and she was willing to pay a girl to come sit in the back of Clancy's dry goods store and sew buttonholes and basted shirts all day, 6 days a week. The wage was 25 cents a day, dinner included, 25 cents, in 1881 money. To put that in terms you can feel, in 2026 money, that is roughly the cost of one bad cup of coffee from a gas station. 1 cup of coffee for a full day of a teenage girl's labour, for a full day of her spine curving over a shirt that somebody else would wear to a party she would never see. And that was the fair wage. That was the going rate. Nobody was cheating her. That was just what a buttonhole was worth in Dakota Territory in the summer of 1881. There is a particular absurdity to that wage, if you are willing to sit with it. Mrs. White, the woman Laura was sewing for, was taking a contract to make shirts. She was selling those shirts to men in Smet at a markup for cash. The men who bought the shirts were paying real money for them. The railroad was paying Charles a real wage. The territorial appropriation was paying real tuition to Vinton. Money was moving through this town in every direction. The only person in the chain whose labour was valued at 1 cup of coffee per day was the 14-year-old girl at the bottom of the chain, doing the work that made the shirts instead of flat cloth. That is not a complaint about Mrs. White. Mrs. White was paying the going rate. That is a complaint about the going rate. And the going rate was the going rate because the frontier had decided collectively that a teenage girl's hand labour was worth roughly the cost of feeding her for the day she worked. The dinner was part of the wage. The dinner was the part of the wage that kept her alive to sew the next day. The 25 cents was the part her mother could put toward Mary. Laura took the work. The book, Little Town on the Prairie, published in 1941 when Laura was in her 70s, describes this summer in a tone I want you to listen for. The tone is proud. The tone is almost jaunty. Laura sits down at the sewing. She works hard. She counts her wages at the end of the week. She's pleased with herself. The book has her multiply in her head and arrive at $1.50 a week, and the arrival is presented as a small triumph. Look what our girl can earn. That tone is the tone of a woman in her 70s remembering a summer when she was 14 and trying to make the memory bearable to hand to a child reader. The summer itself was this. A 14-year-old girl sitting on a chair in the back of a dry goods store in a Dakota Territory town, in heat that could hit 100 degrees, sewing buttonholes into shirts from morning until the light failed. 6 days a week, week after week, the same motion, the same small dense stitches, pulled tight enough to hold but loose enough not to pucker the cloth. The same aching in the fingers, the same cramping in the back, the same dust in the air, the same lamplight when the afternoon clouded over. And here is the part the book does not linger on. Laura was not sewing for pin money. She was not sewing to buy herself a ribbon or save up for a Christmas present. She was sewing to send her sister to school. The money was not hers. It went into the household. It went specifically toward Mary. Every buttonhole Laura pulled tight that summer was a fraction of a cent toward the train fare to Vinton. A fraction of a cent toward the dresses Mary would need. A fraction of a cent toward the books and the slates and the trunk and the 1,000 small expenses the territorial appropriation had not thought to cover. The 14-year-old was working to pay her older sister's bill, and the older sister was sitting blind in a house in Smet, knowing, because nobody in that family lied to each other about money, that the sound of Laura's needle in the next room was the sound of her own future being paid for. There is a particular weight to that knowledge when you are the one being paid for. Mary knew. She had to. The family was too small and too honest about its poverty for her not to know that her little sister was sitting all day in a hot store earning a quarter, so that she, Mary, could go learn to read with her fingers. The books would later make this summer sound like a charming interlude. The record makes it sound like what it was: labour, performed by a child, to cover a bill the government had only partly met, in a household that had no other way to meet it. $9 did not cover what Mary needed. $9 covered a piece of it. The rest came from Charles's railroad wage, from Caroline's gardening and sewing and stretching, from the boarders the family took in, from every other source the household could find. But the $9 Laura produced with her needle, was the margin. It was the difference between sending Mary with what she needed and sending Mary with less than she needed. It was the difference, in some small way, between Mary arriving at Vinton as a respectable student and Mary arriving as a charity case. Let me say something about the math, because the math is what makes this story specific. A summer of buttonholes, $9. A winter of teaching, 2 years later, $75. The teaching wage was more than 8 times the sewing wage, for 3 months of work versus 2 months of work. The teaching was the better money, but the teaching was not available to Laura at 14. The territory's age requirement was 18, and the superintendent who bent the rule to 16 was not going to bend it to 14. So Laura sewed first, at the wage available to a 14-year-old, and taught later, at the wage available to a 16-year-old, and the two wages together, the $9 and the $75, were the pillars of her contribution to Mary's bill across the years between 14 and 18. And here is the thing about the math that the books smooth. The books present Laura's wage labour as a series of triumphs. Laura sewing, Laura teaching, Laura earning her keep. The record presents the same labour as a series of constraints. Laura sewing because the household needed the $9, Laura teaching because the household needed the $75, Laura marrying at 18 because the household could not keep extracting her labour forever, and because the man who drove the cold cutter was the one who got her out of the Bushy house. The triumphs were real. The constraints were real. The books kept the triumphs and smoothed the constraints. The record keeps both. The territorial appropriation paid the tuition and the board. The territorial appropriation was the reason Mary could go at all. But the territorial appropriation did not buy Mary a winter coat, and it did not buy her a second pair of shoes, and it did not buy the dignity of arriving at a college for the blind, with a proper trunk and proper dresses, and the small amenities that meant she would not be the poorest girl in the room. The 25 cents a day bought those things, or tried to, or covered the gap when the other sources fell short. Let me say something about the body cost, because the books skip it and the record should not. Sewing buttonholes all day, 6 days a week, in the heat of a Dakota summer, is the kind of work that breaks down a body that is not yet done growing. The fingers cramp, the back aches, the eyes strain. And there is a particular cruelty in a girl straining her own eyes over buttonholes to save her sister's sight, but that cruelty is the cruelty of the situation, not of anyone's design. Laura was 14. Her spine was still growing. Her hands were still growing. The work she was doing was work that grown women found punishing, and she was doing it for $1/4 a day. Here is the modern analogy, because the modern analogy is the only way to feel the wage. Imagine in 2026 a 14-year-old girl sitting in a factory for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing repetitive handwork that cramps her fingers and curves her spine, for the equivalent of 1 bad cup of coffee per day. Imagine that the coffee money is not hers. It goes to her mother to pay for her older sister's tuition at a school 400 miles away. Imagine that the girl cannot quit because the household needs the coffee money, and there is no other job in the town for a girl her age. Imagine that the girl's sister, the one whose tuition is being paid, is sitting blind in a house nearby, knowing that the sound of the sewing is the sound of her own future being funded. That is the summer of 1881. That is what the 25 cents bought. And the books turned it into a charming anecdote about a spunky pioneer girl. The record turns it back into what it was, a child's wage labour extracted from a 14-year-old body to cover a bill the government had only partly met. Laura was becoming the steady one. Not because she was steady by nature, she was not, the family had always known she was not, but because the family needed a steady one now and Mary could not be it any more, and Laura was standing closest to the door when it opened. The wildness, the asking why, the inability to sit still that had defined Laura her whole childhood, all of it had to be put away that summer in a dry goods store in Smet and replaced with the discipline of a girl who could sew buttonholes for 8 hours without standing up. She did it. She sat down and she did it. And she would keep doing versions of it for the next 4 years, sewing, teaching, working, producing income for a household that needed every dollar it could find, until the household no longer needed her to produce it, at which point she would marry and leave and begin producing for a household of her own. The autumn came. The trunk was packed. Mary was put on the train, and the family that stayed behind in Smet began the long, quiet work of paying for what they had just sent away. Mary was enrolled at the Iowa College for the Blind on November the 23rd, 1881. She was 16. She was blind. She had never been away from her family for more than a few days, and now she was 400 miles from home, in a town she'd never seen, in a building full of strangers. Caroline went with her, at least part of the way. The record suggests Ma Ingalls travelled with Mary to Vinton for the first enrolment. Caroline, who had never been further from her own front door than she had to be, who had spent her whole adult life trying to keep the household in one place, put her blind daughter on a train and rode with her 400 miles to a college in another state and handed her over to strangers. What did Caroline say when she left Mary there? The record does not preserve it. We can guess that she said something practical about writing home, that she checked Mary's trunk one more time, that she did not cry where Mary could hear her, that she got back on the train and rode 400 miles back to Smet, and walked into her own kitchen and started the next meal, and did not mention it again. That was Caroline. The grief went into the work. The work was the grief. The two had been the same thing for so long that there was no seam between them anymore. We will come back to Mary at Vinton. First, the household she left behind, because the household did not stop needing income when Mary left. Mary's absence made the household leaner. Laura, at 14, was the one the family now leaned on. Skip forward 2 years. December the 10th, 1883. Laura receives her first teaching certificate. She is 16, not 15, as the books would later say. The books changed the age. The actual certificate, the piece of paper, is dated December 10th, 1883. The territorial age requirement for a teaching certificate was 18. The district superintendent looked at the girl, looked at the rule, looked at the territory's desperate need for anyone willing to stand in front of a one-room schoolhouse in winter, and made an exception. A teacher's wage in Dakota Territory in the 1880s was around $25 a month, for a term that typically ran 3 months. $75 for a winter's work. Set that beside the $9 of a summer's buttonholes and you can see the scale of the difference. The teaching was the real money. The sewing had been the margin. The teaching was the floor. But the teaching extracted a cost the books soften. Laura's first teaching post was at the Bushi School, the Brewster School in the published books, a one-room country schoolhouse 12 miles from Smet on the open prairie. Board and lodging arranged with a family nearby because a 16-year-old could not commute 12 miles each way in a Dakota winter. The family she boarded with was the Bushi family. The books call them the Brewsters, and the books describe the boarding situation as difficult. The wife was unwell. The household was cold and unhappy. The books leave out the knife. Put yourself in the room. You are Laura. You are 16. You're 12 miles from your family in a claim shanty on the open prairie in the dead of a Dakota winter. You're boarding with a family you barely know. The husband is gone most of the time. The wife is unwell in a way nobody has a name for, what we would now call a severe mental illness, untreated, in a household with no resources to treat it. There are children. You're teaching the children by day. You're sleeping under the same roof as the family by night. The wind outside is steady. The walls are thin. The lamp is low. One night you wake up. There is a sound. You lie in the dark and listen, and the sound resolves into voices. The husband and the wife, arguing. The way they argue every night, except tonight the argument has a different quality, a sharper quality, a quality that makes the hair on your arm stand up. And then you hear it. The wife has picked up a butcher knife. She is threatening her husband with it, in the dark, in the same shanty where you're lying 16 years old, 12 miles from anyone who could help you, in a winter where the wind chill. We know this now, thanks to a meteorologist named Dr. Barb Mays Bowstead, who reconstructed the conditions. The effective wind chill on those cutter rides between the school and Smet was -55 to -65 degrees Fahrenheit. You cannot run. You cannot walk 12 miles in that. You cannot even open the door without the cold taking you. So, you lie there. You're 16. You're listening to a woman threaten her husband with a butcher knife in the next room. You're calculating, the way a 16-year-old calculates in a situation like that, whether the argument will burn itself out or whether it will escalate, and what you will do if it escalates, and whether there is anywhere in this shanty you could put yourself that would be safe, and there is not, because a claim shanty is 1 room and a half loft, and you're in the loft, and the only way down is through the room where the knife is. The argument burns itself out. The wife puts the knife down. The husband goes back to sleep. You do not go back to sleep. You lie there until dawn, and then you get up, and you teach school, because that is what you're there to do, and the $75 is what the household needs, and the household's need does not pause for a night of terror. The books mention this incident. The books do not make you feel it. The books are written for children, and the knife scene, in the books, is a scary moment that passes. The record makes it what it was, a 16-year-old, alone, in a claim shanty, in -60 wind chill, listening to a butcher knife in the dark, knowing she cannot leave, knowing the household needs the $75, knowing she has to teach school in the morning. And the record adds a detail the books could not have included because it happened later. The Bushi family, the real family, not the fictional Brewsters, ended up in a courtroom in 1887, 2 years after Laura's teaching term. Olive Bushi's stepmother-in-law, the mother of the children Laura was teaching, was one of the defendants in a manslaughter trial. The depositions of witnesses which survive in the courthouse records paint a picture of what the Pioneer Girl Project researchers called a strange and tense family. Laura does not mention this in her books. She did not need to. Anyone who boarded with the Bushis for a winter already knew. This is the second income. This is the wage that, for the next 2 years, would sit alongside the sewing and the odd jobs and become the real pillar of Laura's contribution to the household. $75 for 3 months of teaching. $75 earned in a boarding situation that included a knife, in a family that would, within 2 years, be defendants in a manslaughter trial. There is a dark comedy in this, if you are willing to look for it. The Territory's age requirement for a teaching certificate was 18. Laura was 16. The superintendent bent the rule because the Territory needed teachers. The Territory needed teachers because no sane adult wanted to board with the Bushis. The Bouchies were the only family willing to take in a teacher because no sane adult wanted to board with the Bouchies. The whole system ran on the willingness of a 16-year-old girl to sleep in a claim shanty with a butcher knife in the next room, because the adults of Dakota Territory had collectively looked at the Bouchie household and decided reasonably that they would rather not. That is funny, in the way frontier things are funny, which is to say, funny only in retrospect, and only if you did not have to live through it. Laura lived through it. She lay in the loft and listened to the knife, and she got up in the morning and taught school, and the $75 went home, and Mary stayed at Vinton. The system worked. The system ran on a 16-year-old's nerve. The family sent someone to bring her home for weekends. That someone was a young farmer named Almanzo Wilder, who had a fast pair of horses and was willing to drive the 12 miles each way in the cold to fetch the young teacher back to her parents' house for the Sabbath and return her on Sunday night. The courtship that would end in Laura's marriage began as a logistics arrangement. The man who would become her husband entered her life because her family needed a way to get her home from the school they had sent her to teach at 16, so that the household could have the $75. Almanzo was 10 years older than Laura, by the way. The books say 6. The record says 10. A 26-year-old farmer driving 12 miles in -60 wind chill every weekend to fetch a 16-year-old schoolteacher. The books make that sound like romance. The record makes it sound like what it was, which is also romance, but also something harder. A logistics arrangement that became a courtship, that became a marriage that took Laura out of the Ingalls household at 18 and into a household of her own. And the cutter rides themselves deserve a moment, because the books make them sound cozy. A young man, a fast horse, a pretty girl, a blanket, a winter night. The record, thanks to the meteorologist who reconstructed the conditions, gives us the physics. The effective wind chill, combining the ambient wind and the speed of the moving cutter, was in the range of -55 to -65 degrees Fahrenheit. The ride, with stops, took at least an hour and a half each way. 3 hours of travel, in wind chill that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, in an open cutter with a blanket. Every weekend for a 16-year-old girl and a 26-year-old man who was courting her. That is what the courtship was. Not cozy. Cold. Cold enough to kill, if the horse had stumbled, if the cutter had tipped, if they had been caught in a sudden storm. And Laura did it every weekend, because the alternative was staying at the Bouchies, and the Bouchies had a butcher knife. The courtship was, in part, an escape from the boarding situation the Territory had assigned her. The man Laura married was the man who drove the cold cutter that got her away from the knife. Laura married Almanzo Wilder on August 25th, 1885. She was 18. The marriage ended her teaching career because a married woman in the 1880s did not, as a rule, continue teaching. The culture did not allow it, and the Wilder household, such as it was going to be, needed her labour at home. The teaching wage that had been propping up the Ingalls household for 2 years stopped. Laura left. The household continued without her income, but Mary was still at Vinton. The bill was still being paid, and the family found other ways to cover it. Laura taught 2 more terms. She was disappointed, by her own account, to leave school without a diploma. "This was a very great unhappiness to me," she wrote later. "I had always so longed for an education, and had hoped to at least graduate from high school." She did not graduate, she taught instead. Because the household needed the $75, and the household's need came first. The books would later make the teaching sound like a vocation. The record makes it what it was. Wage labour, performed by a teenager, at an age the law said was too young, in conditions the law would not have inspected, in a claim shanty with a knife in the next room, for money the family could not have done without. Now, back to Mary, at Vinton. The Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton was, by the standards of the 1880s, a serious institution. It had been open since 1852, nearly 30 years by the time Mary arrived. It occupied a real campus on the edge of town. It had dormitories, classrooms, a music room with an organ, a shop where the students learned trades. Mary Ingalls would attend the school for a total of 7 years, from 1881 through 1889. Here is the fact that the books could not have told you, because Laura herself may not have known it when she wrote them. Mary did not learn Braille. Braille, the system of 6-dot cells that every blind reader in the world uses today, was not the system taught at the Iowa College for the Blind in the 1880s. Braille did not arrive at Vinton until 1920. The system Mary learned was called New York Point. It was a different raised dot code, invented by a man named William Bell Waite in New York in the late 1860s, and endorsed for use in schools for the blind across the United States at a meeting of the American Association of Instructors of the Blind in 1871. By 1910, New York Point was the most widely used tactile reading code in the United States. 57% of blind readers used it, compared to 28% for American Braille and a smaller fraction for European Braille. New York Point was a good system. It was, in some ways, more efficient than Braille. It used horizontal cells of varying width, 2 dots high, with the most commonly used letters taking up the least space. Helen Keller read it. The schools taught it. For decades, it was the system, and then it lost. The war between New York Point and Braille was one of the quieter wars in American education, and Braille won. By the 1920s, the schools were switching. By the 1930s, when Laura was writing the books, New York Point was already a relic. By the time the books were in print, the system Mary had spent 7 years learning was on its way to extinction. Today, almost nobody alive can read New York Point. The letters Mary wrote home, if any survive in her own hand, are written in a code that is now dead. The receipt for her education is written in a language no one can open. Put yourself in Mary's place for a moment. You're 16. You're blind. You have arrived at a college 400 miles from home. You're going to spend 7 years here. And the thing you're going to learn, the thing that is going to give you back the capacity to read, to receive words without someone speaking them to you, is a system that will, within your lifetime, become unreadable. You do not know this. Nobody knows this. You learn the dots. You learn the cells. You learn to run your fingers across the page and feel the letters form. And you get good at it, because you are the steady one, the one who sits with a task until it is done. You become fluent in a language that will die. Picture the daily shape of those 7 years. The Iowa College for the Blind ran on a schedule as regular as a clock. The students rose early. In dormitories they navigated by memory and touch. They dressed, a slower business for a blind student, every button found by feel, every garment checked for orientation by the seam or the collar. They went to breakfast in a dining hall where the layout was fixed, and the seats were learned, and the food was eaten with the particular care a blind person learns to bring to a plate they cannot see. Then classes. New York Point in the morning, when the fingers were freshest and the mind could hold the dots. Music after, the organ, the piano for those who preferred it, the singing the school taught as a group discipline. Handcrafts in the afternoon, sewing, knitting, beadwork, the trades the school drilled into its female students as the trades that would let them, in theory, support themselves. Navigation practice. Letter writing in New York Point to families 400 miles away. Evenings for study, for music, for the social life of a residential school full of young people who all understood what it was to live without sight. That last detail matters more than the rest. The school was the only place in Mary's life where her blindness was normal. In Smet, she was the blind daughter, the exception, the charge, the one the household organised itself around. In Vinton, she was one of dozens. Her classmates were blind. Her teachers understood blindness. The routines of the school were built for people who could not see, which meant that Mary, inside those routines, was not struggling against a sighted world. She was moving through a world built for her. The relief of that, the simple physical relief of being in a room where every layout was memorized, where every task was taught by touch, where no one was surprised that she could not see, must have been enormous. And here is the part about New York Point that the books could not include, because Laura did not know the system was dying when she wrote them. New York Point was, by the time the books were published, already losing the war. Mary did not know this was coming. She learned New York Point the way a person learns any language, fluently, completely, with the assumption that the language would be there forever. Languages are not forever. Mary's language died within her lifetime, and the books when they came out called the system Braille, because Laura did not know the difference, or did not think it mattered, or did not want to explain to a 1940s reader that there had once been a different system that had died. The school gave Mary other things. Music. The organ became her instrument. The thing she could do in a room that made her a performer rather than a dependent. Handcrafts, sewing, knitting, beadwork, and the making of fly nets for horses, which would become, in the years after graduation, her one steady source of income. Fly nets, that is worth stopping on. A fly net is a net made of knotted cord that you drape over a horse in summer to keep the flies off. They are still used today. In the 1880s, every working horse in Dakota Territory needed one, and someone had to knot them by hand, and a blind woman with 7 years of handcraft training could knot them by touch, as well as a sighted woman could knot them by sight. Mary made fly nets. She sold them. That was her income in the years after graduation, the one trade the school had given her that the Dakota economy actually had a use for. Not beadwork, not knitting. Fly nets for horses. Navigation, the capacity to count steps, to memorize layouts, to move through a space by sound and memory, and the brush of a hand along a wall. And the school gave her something the record barely preserves, but that the Pioneer Girl Project researchers were able to confirm. Mary had a serious beau at the blind school, a young man, also a student, who proposed marriage. She refused. The reason, as the family remembered it, was this. Mary could not bear the thought of having a child whose face she would never see. Hold that. A blind woman, in the 1880s, refusing a marriage proposal because she cannot imagine bringing a child into the world and never seeing its face. That is not a symbol. That is not a metaphor. That is a specific woman making a specific choice for a specific reason. And the reason is the kind of reason that breaks you when you let yourself think about it for more than a second. Mary went back to Smet. She lived in her parents' house. She never married. She played the organ. She made fly nets for horses and sold them. She read, in New York Point, the dead language, for the rest of her life. She never saw the face of anyone she loved again. She had already decided at 24 that she would not risk seeing a child's face only in her hands. The school changed its rules while Mary was there. The original territorial appropriation had covered 5 years of schooling. But in 1885, 4 years into Mary's enrollment, the Dakota Territorial Council amended the law. Each blind student, the amended law read, was entitled to a total of 8 years of schooling, not 5. Mary was given 3 more years. She stayed. She completed the full course. She graduated on June 12, 1889, at the age of 24. The graduation was a real ceremony. The school held one every June. The students who had completed the full course walked across a stage, or were guided across it depending on their degree of sight, and received a diploma, and the audience clapped, and there were speeches about usefulness and self-reliance and the dignity of labour, because the 19th century could not celebrate anything without mentioning the dignity of labour. Mary walked across that stage. She received her diploma. She was, by every measure the school and the territory had set, a success. The Pioneer Girl Project researchers note one gap in Mary's record. She was most likely not in school during the 1887 to 88 year. The reason is not recorded. She may have been ill. She may have come home for a family emergency. She may have taken a year off for reasons the documents do not preserve. The gap is small. It is worth noting only because it is the kind of detail that reminds you Mary was a real person with a real life that did not fit neatly into a 7-year block, that there were years within the 7 years when she was somewhere else, doing something the record has lost. Mary came home a different person. The girl who had left Smet had sat in a chair. The woman who came back walked through the house. She found things. She sat at the organ and played. She was, in Laura's later word, gay, meaning in the language of the time, bright, cheerful, alive. The school had given her back the capacity to be a person in a room. And here is the thing about that return that the books cannot fully hold. Mary came home to a household that had been paying for her absence for 7 years. The family that greeted her at the door, Charles, Caroline, Laura, Carrie, Grace, was leaner than the family that had put her on the train. Laura was married now, living with Almanzo, no longer producing income for the Ingalls household. Carrie was working odd jobs. Grace was still in school. Charles was still at the railroad. Caroline was still stretching. The household had held together, but it had held together by becoming a machine for paying Mary's bill, and the machine had been running for 7 years, and the people inside the machine were tired. Mary walked back into that household as a graduate. She walked in with a diploma, with New York Point, with the organ, with the fly nets, with the capacity to move and make and read. She walked in as, in the language of the time, a useful person, and the household that had paid for her usefulness, the household that had sewn and taught and stretched and boarded and appropriated and begged for 7 years to make her useful, received her back with relief and with love, and with the quiet recognition that the bill was not over. The bill was not over because Mary, useful as she now was, could not earn a living wage. The fly nets brought in a few cents. The organ gave her a place in the church. The handicrafts let her contribute. But the room and board, the food she ate, the clothes she wore, the roof over her head, the coal for her stove, were still being paid for by someone else. The territorial appropriation had paid for the school. The family was now paying for the life after the school, and the family would pay for it, in one form or another, for the next 42 years. But the world she came back to was already changing under her, and 3 years after her graduation, a letter would arrive that closed the door on the school forever. Before we get to that letter, we have to talk about the books, because the books are the reason most of what you know about this family is wrong, and the books are the reason the 25 cents got remembered as charming. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not begin writing the Little House books until she was in her 60s. The first one was published in 1932. The last one she completed, These Happy Golden Years, came out in 1943. Little Town on the Prairie, the book that contains the scene of Laura sewing shirts for 25 cents, was published in 1941, when Laura was 74 years old. 60 years had passed between the summer of the buttonholes and the page that described it. 60 years is a long time, long enough to forget, long enough to soften, long enough to decide, consciously or not, what to include and what to leave out, and what to change so that the story you're handing to children is a story children can carry. Laura changed the cause of Mary's blindness. The medical record, reconstructed in 2013, points to viral meningoencephalitis, a brain fever. The book says scarlet fever. Dr. Beth Tarini, the paediatrician who led the paediatric study, has argued the change was probably deliberate. Scarlet fever was a disease a 1930s reader would recognise. Brain fever, by the 1930s, sounded archaic, almost theatrical. Laura changed her own age when she tested for her teaching certificate. The book says 15. The certificate says 16. The Territory's official age requirement was 18. The change makes Laura younger in the book than she was in life, which makes the story more dramatic. Laura changed Almanzo's age. The books say he was 6 years older than her. The record says 10. Laura changed the timing of the events. She compressed. She reordered. She omitted whole years. These are not accusations. Laura was writing memoir for children, not transcribing a ledger. The changes she made were the changes a writer makes when she's trying to give a child reader a story they can hold. But the shaping had a cost, and the cost is the thing tonight is trying to recover. The shaping made the labour invisible. The 25 cents a day in the book is a charming detail. The teaching is a vocation. The poverty is backdrop. The bushi knife is a scary moment that passes. The dead language is not mentioned because Laura did not know it was dead. The marriage proposal is not mentioned because it did not fit the children's book frame. And then there is the matter of the second pair of hands on the manuscript. Laura did not write the books alone. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, was a professional writer, a journalist, a novelist, a biographer with a national reputation by the time her mother began the manuscripts in the 1930s. Rose had grown up on the farms Laura and Almanzo struggled to work after their marriage. Rose had watched the household's poverty from the inside, had left it as fast as she could, had built a career in a country that was hungry for exactly the kind of pioneer origin story her mother was sitting on. The editorial relationship between Laura and Rose is one of the quieter controversies in American literary history. The manuscripts that survive in Laura's hand are shorter, plainer, less shaped than the published books. The published books show the marks of a professional writer's intervention. How much was Laura and how much was Rose is a question scholars have been arguing for decades. Here is the part that matters for tonight. Rose, by the 1930s, was one of the most vocal libertarian writers in America. She was a fierce opponent of the New Deal. She had come to believe that the pioneer story, the story of self-reliant families making their own way without government help, was the story the country needed to hear to counter the Depression-era turn toward federal support. The Ingalls family, shaped the right way, was a perfect vehicle for that argument. A family that had crossed the plains, survived blizzards, educated its blind daughter through its own labour. That family was an argument against the very idea that government assistance was necessary. The territorial appropriation, in this telling, had to disappear. The teaching wage had to become a vocation. The 25 cents had to become a charming detail. Bill had to go because the bill was evidence that the pioneer family had in fact needed help, and the help had come from a government appropriation, and that fact did not fit the story Rose wanted the country to read. There is evidence that Rose was already working with this material years before the books. In 1915, 25 years before The Long Winter was published, Rose wrote a newspaper serial for the San Francisco Bulletin called Behind the Headlight, The Life Story of a Railway Engineer. The serial ran in 24 installments during October and November of 1915, and it used Laura's memories of the hard winter of 1880 and 81, the same winter that would later become the Long Winter. Rose was already shaping the family's story for public consumption in a newspaper 2 decades before her mother began the books. This is not an accusation of bad faith. Rose believed the self-reliance version. Laura believed it too, or wanted to. Both women had lived the unsmoothed version, and both women, in the 1930s, chose to write the smoothed one, because the smoothed one was the one that sold, the one that the country wanted, the one that let the pioneer past serve as an argument for the pioneer future. The bill was inconvenient to the argument. The bill went, and there is one more piece of the editorial story that predates the books entirely. Laura's first manuscript was not a children's book. It was an adult autobiography called Pioneer Girl. She wrote it in 1930 and 1931, and Rose edited it 3 times, and they tried to sell it to magazine publishers in New York and to book publishers as a non-fiction book for adults. It was rejected. Every publisher they sent it to turned it down. The adult version of the Ingalls story, the unsmoothed version, or at least a less smoothed version, was not the version the market wanted in 1931. What the market wanted, it turned out, was a children's book. In mid-February of 1931, Laura found a surprise in her rural Missouri mailbox, a letter from a New York publisher named Alfred A. Knopf. An editor named Marion Fiery, the head of Knopf's children's department, had read a manuscript Laura had submitted called When Grandma Was a Little Girl. Fiery wanted Laura to expand it by 15,000 words. That manuscript, expanded, became Little House in the Big Woods, the first book in the series, published in 1932. The path from the rejected adult autobiography to the beloved children's book is the path the Ingalls story took to reach the country. Pioneer Girl, the raw, adult, less-shaped version, sat in a drawer for 80 years. It was finally published in 2014 by the Pioneer Girl Project, and it became a bestseller 70 years after the children's books that were built out of it. The adult version, when it finally reached the public, sold. But in 1931, the adult version could not sell. The country wanted the children's version. The children's version is the version that survived. Pioneer Girl is the document the scholars use now to track what Laura actually wrote before Rose's editing and the children's book framing got to it. It is where the Pioneer Girl Project researchers found the details that confirm or contradict the published books. It is where they found the New York Point correction, the Bouchy family manslaughter trial, the marriage proposal, the fly nets, the teaching certificate date. pioneer girl is the ledger. The published books are the story. The distance between them is the distance tonight has been trying to close. The books could not have said any of this. The books were for children. The books were published in a country that wanted its pioneer stories to be about self-reliance and grit. A book that said, the older daughter went blind and the younger daughter was set to wage labour at 14 to pay for it. And the wage labour was hard and the pay was a pittance. And the family was poor in a way the books do not fully show. And the system Mary learned is now a dead language. And the whole story was edited by a woman who needed it to prove a political point. That book would not have been the book the country wanted to read. So, the bill was smoothed. The labour was made charming. The dead language was not mentioned. The knife was softened. The marriage proposal was cut. The appropriation was left out. And the family that emerged from the books was the family the country wanted to believe the frontier had produced. Sturdy, self-reliant, dignified, the women cheerful and the men dreaming, and the children growing up strong. That family existed. It is not a lie. But it existed alongside another family. The family that counted cups of flour, that put a 14-year-old in a dry goods store, that put a 16-year-old in front of a Prairie schoolhouse with a knife in the next room, that scraped and sewed and taught and appropriated and begged for 7 years to keep one blind daughter in a college 400 miles away, learning a language that would die. That family is in the record. That family is the one these chapters have been recovering. The two families are the same family. The books show you one. The record shows you the other. The distance between them is the distance between a story a country could love and a story a household actually lived. In November of 1889, 5 months after Mary graduated from Vinton, Dakota Territory ceased to exist. It was split into 2 states, North Dakota and South Dakota, admitted to the Union on the 2nd of November, 1889. The territorial government dissolved. The territorial laws, including the law that had paid for Mary's schooling, were replaced by state laws. And the new state of South Dakota, where Smet stood and where Mary had returned to live, took a different approach to the education of its blind citizens. The territorial appropriation had been generous by the standards of the time. It had paid tuition and board for up to 8 years at an out-of-state school. The new state of South Dakota was less generous. It put the burden for the education of blind residents on individuals or on individual localities. It did not, as the territory had, simply write a check to the Iowa College for the Blind for any blind South Dakotan who qualified. The practical consequence of this change landed on Mary 3 years later. In 1892, Mary, back into Smet, blind, 27 years old, 3 years out of Vinton, sought to return to the Iowa College for the Blind. The reasons are not fully recorded. She may have wanted further training. She may have wanted the community. She may have wanted simply to go back to the one place in her life where she had been a person, among people who understood her, instead of a blind woman in a sighted household, in a small town on the Dakota Prairie. She was told in writing that it would be impossible. The school could not take her. The state of South Dakota would not pay. The territorial appropriation that had covered her for 7 years was gone, replaced by a state system that did not extend the same support. The door that had opened in 1881, when the family put her on the train with the trunk and the dresses and the slates, had closed behind her in 1889, and the state that now stood where the territory had been was not going to open it again. Put yourself in Mary's place. You're 27. You are blind. You have spent 7 years earning the right to call yourself educated. You have learned to read in a language that is already starting to die. You have learned to play the organ. You have learned to make fly nets for horses. You've graduated with a diploma. You've done everything the school and the territory and your family asked of you. You've refused a marriage proposal because you could not bear the thought of a child whose face you would never see. You have accepted the chair, the organ, the fly nets, the life in your parents' house. You have made peace with it. And now a letter arrives from the school, from the one place in your life where your blindness was normal, where the layouts were memorized, where the routines were built for people who could not see, where you were not an exception. And the letter says, you cannot come back. The support that made your education possible is no longer available. The door is closed. The letter does not say this cruelly. The letter says it the way letters from institutions say things. Politely, regretfully, with reference to the relevant statute. But the effect is the same. The door is closed, the community is gone. The one place you were not an exception is now a place you cannot return to. Mary did not return to Vinton. She stayed in Smet. She lived in her parents' house. She played the organ. She read, in New York Point, the dead language. She made fly nets for horses and sold them. She visited friends. She wrote poetry. She lived, in other words, the life the 7 years at Vinton had equipped her to live. A life that was, by the standards of a blind woman in the 1890s, full and dignified and productive. But she had lost the school. She had lost the community. She had lost the one place in her life where her blindness had not been the defining fact. And she had lost it not because of anything she had done, but because a line had been drawn on a map in Washington, D.C., and the territory that had paid for her had become a state that would not. There is a broader context here that is worth a moment, because the context is what makes the letter land. The 1880s and 90s were a period of retreat across the United States on the question of public support for vulnerable people. The Reconstruction era, the brief period after the Civil War when the federal government had been willing to spend money on the welfare of newly freed people and on public institutions more broadly, was over. The Gilded Age was setting in. The philosophy of the time was moving towards self-reliance, individual responsibility, and the contraction of public expenditure. The territorial appropriation that had paid for Mary's schooling was a relic of an earlier, more generous moment in American public life. The state of South Dakota in 1889 was a product of the newer, less generous moment. The letter Mary received in 1892 was not an accident. It was a symptom. Across the country in the early 1890s, state governments were cutting support for institutions, for the blind, the deaf, the mentally ill, the poor. The poorhouse was still the default. The school was becoming a privilege rather than a right, and a blind woman in a small Dakota town asking to return to the school that had made her a person was told, politely, regretfully, with reference to the relevant statute, that the privilege was no longer available to her. This is the political economy of Mary Ingalls' blindness. A flaw, briefly, a withdrawal. A family left standing on what remained, building the rest with their hands for the rest of Mary's life. The closure of that door is the quiet sequel to the story the books tell. The books end, more or less, with Mary's graduation, with the triumph of the blind girl who learned to read and play and walk and be a person. The record goes on. The record shows that the triumph was followed by a letter, 3 years later, that said the triumph could not be extended, could not be returned to, could not be built on. The state closed the door. Mary lived the rest of her life, 36 more years, until her death in 1928, on the Smet side of it. Mary Amelia Ingalls spent 49 years blind. She was 14 when the fever took her sight. She was 63 when she died. 7 of those years were at Vinton, learning to be a person in a dark world. 42 of those years were in Smet, in her parents' house, then in the houses of her sisters after her parents died, living the life the 7 years had equipped her to live. What does 42 years of blindness in one small Dakota town look like day by day? It looks like waking up every morning in the same dark you went to sleep in. It looks like reaching for the same objects, in the same places, by memory, because the sight is not coming back to help you find them. It looks like counting steps to the kitchen. It looks like sitting at the organ and playing, for the 100th time, the pieces you learned at Vinton, because the organ is the one place the darkness does not reach. It looks like reading, in New York Point, slowly, by touch, the same letters you have read 1,000 times, because reading is the one way to receive words without having to ask someone to speak them. It looks like making fly nets, knotting cord by feel, the same knot, the same spacing, the same net, finished and set aside and started again. Because the horses in Dakota still need fly nets and someone will buy them, and the few cents they bring in are the few cents Mary can contribute to the household that is keeping her. She never married. She had refused the proposal at Vinton for the reason the family remembered. She could not bear the thought of a child whose face she would never see, and she never married after. She played the organ for hours, sometimes for company, sometimes for nobody. She read, in a language that was dying around her, by touch. She never saw the face of anyone she loved again. Not her mother, not her father, not her sisters, not her sisters' children, not the nieces and nephews who grew up around her chair. The church in Smet had an organ, and Mary played it sometimes. The social life of a small Dakota town in the 1890s and 1900s was not nothing, and Mary, by all surviving accounts, participated in it, visiting, being visited, playing the organ, reading, writing, contributing what she could. She was not idle. She was not in the 19th century sense a charge, because the fly nets and the organ and the handcrafts let her produce something. But the production was small. It was not a living. It was the difference between sitting and making, and Mary spent 42 years on the making side of it. Charles Ingalls died on June 8th, 1902, of cardiovascular disease at the age of 66. He was given Masonic rites at his funeral. He was a Freemason. That detail is not in the books. The books give you Pa with a fiddle and a covered wagon and a dream. The record gives you Pa as a Mason, a railroad storekeeper, a man who held still for a decade after a lifetime of running, and who died at 66 of the heart condition that may have been waiting in him all along. Caroline Ingalls died on April 20th, 1924, at the age of 84 on Easter Sunday. She had outlived her husband by 22 years. She had held the house on 3rd Street in Smet, the house Charles built, the one the Channel has spent whole nights inside, for those 22 years, mostly with Mary beside her. Mary and Caroline in the house together, the blind daughter and the widow mother, for over 2 decades. Caroline was Mary's constant companion, and when Caroline died, Mary, by the family's account, never completely recovered from the loss. There is a detail here that the record preserves and that the books do not. After Caroline's death, Mary went to visit her sister Carrie in Keystone, South Dakota, in 1926. Just before she was to return to Smet, Mary suffered a stroke. She recovered, partially, but the stroke was the beginning of the end. She died in 1928, blind for 49 years, in her sister's care. After their parents' deaths, Mary lived with her sisters, Carrie, who had moved to the Black Hills, and Grace, who had married and settled. They took Mary in. They covered her keep. They did it without complaint because Mary was their sister, and the family had been covering her keep, in one form or another, since she was 14. And here is the fact that lands last, and that the books could never have included, because of when it happened. Laura did not begin publishing the Little House books until 1932. Little House in the Big Woods came out 4 years after Mary died. Mary Ingalls never read the books. She never saw what Laura had made of their childhood. She never knew that the scarlet fever version of her blindness would reach millions of readers. She never knew that the 25 cents a day would be remembered by a country as a charming detail. She never knew that the territorial appropriation and the teaching wage and the flour barrel and the 7 years at Vinton would be smoothed in the published version into a story of pioneer triumph. She never knew that the system she had learned to read in New York Point was already a dead language by the time the books reached print. She died in 1928, blind for 49 years, in her sister's care, having lived the unsmoothed version. The smoothed version came after. The smoothed version was for the country. The unsmoothed version was for Mary, and Mary took it with her. That is a mercy, perhaps, or a loss. The record does not say which. The record only says that Mary Ingalls died in 1928, in Smet, blind, at 63, and that the books that would make her childhood famous began to appear 4 years later, written by the sister whose needle, and whose teaching and whose books had, across 49 years, covered the cost of keeping Mary in the world. But the cost did not end with Mary's death. The cost continued in Laura for the rest of Laura's life. Laura carried the bill forward, in her body and in her books, for the rest of her life. She carried it in her body in the form of the work itself, the years of sewing, the years of teaching, the years of farm labour after her marriage to Almanzo, the years of writing, in her 60s and 70s, that produced the 8 books. The hands that had sewn buttonholes in a Dakota dry goods store in 1881 were the hands that 50 years later wrote the manuscript of Little House in the Big Woods. The same hands. The same discipline of sitting still and producing, learned at 14 in the back of Clancy's store, applied at 74 to the production of a children's book. That is not a metaphor. That is a physical continuity. The skill Laura learned that summer was the skill of sitting down and working whether she wanted to or not, for as long as the work needed doing, for the wage the work paid. She learned it sewing shirts. She applied it to teaching school. She applied it to running a farm. She applied it, eventually, to writing books. The discipline was the same discipline. The wage was different. But the discipline, the capacity to sit, to produce, to keep producing past the point of comfort, was forged in a dry goods store in Smet for 25 cents a day to send her sister to school. She carried it too in her relationship with Mary. The correspondence continued, across the miles for as long as Mary lived. Laura in Missouri writing to Mary in Smet, Mary in Smet. Reading Laura's letters in New York Point, writing back in New York Point. The two sisters connected by the same postal system that had connected Mary to her family during the 7 years at Vinton. Laura sent money when she could. Laura sent news. The famous sister, the one whose books were beginning by the 1930s, to bring in real income, sent a portion of that income back to the sister whose blindness had, in the most literal sense, made the books possible. Because the books were about the family, and the family had been shaped by Mary's blindness, and the labour that had shaped the family had been Laura's, and the labour had earned, by the 1930s, a small royalty that could be shared, and there is a detail here that the record preserves and that is worth sitting with. Mary and Laura were corresponding in New York Point and in print, through the years when Laura was writing the books. Mary was reading the letters. Mary was not reading the books. The books did not exist yet. But Mary was reading the letters, in the dead language, by touch. The same fingers that had learned New York Point at Vinton were reading Laura's news from Missouri in the early 1920s, in a code that was already on its way out. The last letters Mary ever read were in a language that, within a decade of her death, almost nobody would be able to read. That is the braid of this story. A needle, a wage, a school, a dead language, a marriage proposal refused, a butcher knife in a claim shanty, a letter that closed a door, a stroke in a sister's house, a book that came out 4 years too late. The bill was real. The bill was paid. The bill was paid by specific people with specific bodies at specific costs, and the bill did not stop being paid when Mary died, because the books that Mary never read were the books that finally let Laura turn the bill into something the country could love. The bill became the story became the royalty became, in some small way, the back pay for the labour Laura had performed 50 years earlier in a dry goods store for 25 cents a day. And the school Mary attended is gone too. The Iowa College for the Blind, renamed the Iowa Braille and Sight-Saving School in the 20th century after Braille won the war that New York Point lost, closed its residential campus in Vinton in 2011. The property, 11 buildings on 48 acres, was sold to the city of Vinton for $1. The school's educational functions were dispersed into students' hometown districts. The campus that had taught Mary Ingalls to read in a dead language, to play the organ, to make fly nets, to walk through a room without being moved through it, that campus is no longer a school. There is a cruelty in that closure if you are willing to look for it. The school existed for 159 years. It opened in 1852, when the idea of educating blind people at public expense was still radical. It closed in 2011, when the idea of publicly funding specialized institutions for vulnerable people had become once again contested. The school opened in a more generous era and closed in a less generous one, and the arc between its opening and its closing is the same arc that runs from the territorial appropriation that paid for Mary's education to the state letter that told her the door was closed. The school is gone, the language is dead, the woman is dead, the books are still in print, the book that smoothed the bill is still on the shelf. The ledger that the book smoothed is the thing these hours were for. And one last fact, because the record deserves it. The Iowa Braille and Sight-Saving School before it closed kept historical records. Mary Ingalls' grade books were among them. A visitor to the school in the years before it closed reported that the staff brought out the historical records, and there, in a file, were Mary Ingalls' grade books, the actual paper, the actual marks, the actual record of what a blind girl from Dakota Territory learned in a dead language, in a school that no longer exists, paid for by an appropriation that no longer exists, in a territory that no longer exists. The grade books are somewhere now, probably in an archive, probably in a box, probably readable, if you know where to look, by the few scholars who still care. The system they are written in is not readable, except by the handful of people in the world who can still decode New York Point. The receipt for Mary's education is sitting in a box, in a language no one opens, in a building that is no longer a school. That is the final shape of this story. A bill, paid in buttonholes, for an education in a dead language, in a school that closed, recorded in grade books that no one can read, memorialized in books that smoothed the bill into a charming detail. The woman who earned the wage wrote the books. The woman whose education the wage paid for never read them. The language both of them lived inside is gone. The record is what is left. Come back to the number we started with. 25 cents. $1.50 a week. $9 for a summer. A fraction of the train fare to Vinton. A fraction of the dresses. A fraction of the slates. A fraction of the dignity that separated a student from a charity case. A fraction of the bill. The bill was real. The bill was paid. The bill was paid by specific people with specific bodies at specific costs. Caroline paid it in flour barrels and stretched cloth and folded grief for the rest of her life. Charles paid it in a railroad storekeeper's post he had spent his adult life refusing, held for a decade because the blind daughter needed a stationary household. Carrie and Grace paid it in the years after their parents died by taking Mary into their households and covering her keep for the rest of her life. The Dakota Territorial Legislature paid it, briefly, in an appropriation that covered tuition and board for 7 years and then vanished when the territory became a state. The Iowa College for the Blind paid it, in 7 years of teaching that converted a blind teenager into a blind adult who could read, in a language that is now dead, and play the organ and make fly nets, and walk through a room. And Laura paid it. Laura paid it in buttonholes at 25 cents a day. Laura paid it in teaching at $75 a term, at an age the law said was too young, in a claim shanty where a knife came out in the dark. Laura paid it in a childhood redirected, at 14, into wage labour. Laura paid it in a marriage, at 18, that began as a logistics arrangement for getting her home from the wage labour the family had assigned her. Laura paid it in a lifetime of discipline forged in a dry goods store. Laura paid it in the books, which shaped the bill into a story the country could love, because the country could not have loved the ledger. The bill was paid by all of them. The bill was paid in disproportionate share by the women. The bill was paid in the largest single share of the labour, by the younger sister, whose hands became the household's engine the year the older sister's eyes went dark. The books made the paying look easy. The record does not have that option. The record only has the numbers, and the names, and the dates, and the long, quiet fact that a family on the Dakota Prairie, confronted with a blind daughter and a government appropriation that covered the floor and not the roof, covered the rest with the labour of a teenage girl whose hands that summer were worth exactly 25 cents a day to the dry goods store that hired her, and worth considerably more than that to the sister whose future those hands were quietly building, one buttonhole at a time. There is a question I want to leave you with, and it is not a rhetorical one. The question is this: how many other bills like Mary's are still being paid right now by teenage girls whose labour is valued at the cost of feeding them for the day? How many other appropriations cover the floor and not the roof? How many other schools are teaching languages that will die, How many other letters are arriving, politely, regretfully, with reference to the relevant statute telling someone that the door is closed? The Ingalls story is one family's story. The structure of the Ingalls story is many families' story. The bill is not unique to Mary. The bill is what happens in any era when a household absorbs a catastrophe and the public support covers only part of the cost. The bill is what is left after the floor. The bill is always paid by someone, with their hands, with their time, with their childhood. The books smooth the bill. The record shows it. Tonight showed it. And one last thing. The next time you read the sewing chapter in Little Town on the Prairie, the one where Laura sits down at Mrs. White's table and earns her $1.50 a week and feels pleased with herself, read it with the record underneath it. Read it knowing that the $1.50 was a child's wage, that the sewing was buying her sister's education, that the books softened the labour because the country could not have loved the labour as it was. Read it, knowing that the system the sister learned at the school, the wage paid for, is now a dead language. Read it knowing that the sister never read the books. Read it knowing that the woman who wrote the books was the woman who sewed the shirts, and that the discipline that let her write the books at 74 was forged, that summer, in a dry goods store for 25 cents a day, to send her sister to a school that would teach her a language that would die. The book is still charming. The book is still loved. The book is still on the shelf. The ledger underneath it is what tonight was for. The system Mary learned to read in is a dead language now. Almost nobody alive can read what she read. The school she learned it in closed its doors in 2011. The state that closed the door on her return has never reopened it. The books that smoothed the bill are still in print, still read by children, still loved. The ledger the book smoothed is the thing tonight has been trying to show you. The Prairie did make them strong. That part was accurate. What the books left out is what strength cost, who paid it, who kept paying it after the story ended, and why the version that survived had to look the way it did. Strength is what people call a wound after enough years have passed. The records know the difference. The monument does not. The wound was a fever in February of 1879. The strength was a girl in a dry goods store the following summer, sewing shirts for $1 a day. The language the fever's daughter learned to read in is dead. The sister who paid for it wrote the books that made the paying look easy. The books are still on the shelf. The dead language is not on any shelf. The bill is still on the table. You were told the Little House books showed you everything. They showed you the lamp. Tonight, you saw the needle in the next room, and the girl holding it, and the wage it paid, and the door it opened, and the door that closed behind it, and the language that died on the other side. Good night.